Thanks very much, Lokabandhu, for that warm, lovely introduction. And thanks very much to all of you for coming on a Sunday morning. Great turnout. I suppose if this is, if you're still on the flight that took off on the first night, this is like the last on-flight video or something. But it should take you to the present moment as well. So I've titled my talk Doors to Freedom, the Buddha's Psychology of Liberation, because really that's the theme of the festival, so I thought it'd be good to talk about it. Doors to freedom. What is freedom? What do we aspire to when we talk of freedom? There's actually there's two kinds of freedom, you could say. There's firstly the freedom to do what we want. That's an important kind of freedom, but that freedom is more associated with political and social institutions, and we're very fortunate in the UK at the moment to have the kinds of freedoms to allow us to come to a muddy field in Somerset and do what we want. There's another kind of freedom, which is a freedom from what obstructs us, from what gets in the way of ourselves. And that's the kind of freedom, perhaps, on the whole, that we're looking for through Buddhism. And that freedom, it doesn't exclude, these freedoms tie up. You think of Aung San Suu Kyi campaigning for freedom for the Burmese people to do what they want through her own practice of Buddhism. So this is the area I want to talk about, freedom, but I'm going to take a slightly different angle from usual, hence the Lokabandhu mentioned in novels. It's very, very appropriate. I want to experiment by talking about depth psychology, the depths of our psyche and how that's involved in keeping us from freedom, and how through Buddhist practice we might be able to transform the depths of our experience. I'm using a metaphor of depth. It's just a metaphor, but it's one that crops up. To start off this account, I'm going to talk about the Nagas. Those of you familiar with Buddhist mythology would have heard of the Nagas. These enormous dragon snake-like beings. Often they're described as living at the bottom of the sea. And they don't just live at the bottom of the sea, they live all over the place. These beings are perhaps best translated into European culture as dragons. They're like dragons. But dragons have a bit of a bad reputation in European culture, perhaps. They're often seen as simply greedy and to be put to death by brave warriors. You know, they hold up maidens and things like that. But in Buddhist countries, especially China, you might think of all their dragon symbolism. The Naga has a much more positive role. They're a symbol of strength and beauty. There's an early Buddhist discourse called the Vammaka Sutta, which is very interesting. It involves a monk called Kassapa. He has a dream. He has a dream. The way it's said is that a deity of surpassing radiance appeared to him where he was living. But that's like code for he had a dream. A special dream, a significant dream. And in this dream, he encountered an anthill, Indian anthill, big heap of earth made by the ants. And this anthill fumes by night and flames by day. And a wise man instructs him. He gives him a knife and says, dig in the anthill. Kassapa digs in the anthill and pulls out all these various objects, strange Indian objects, including a tortoise. And having done so, he's instructed in each case to just pull it out and let it go, let go this object. But eventually, at the bottom of the anthill, he finds a Naga. And the wise man said, leave the Naga. You should respect the Naga and honour the Naga. And the Buddha, and Kassapa, this monk, he takes his dream to the Buddha. So here we have a kind of dream workshop in ancient India. as Maharatna Jyoti was doing here. And the Buddha gives an interpretation. It's quite straightforward, really. He says, the anthill is the human being, fuming by night, dreaming, mental process is still going on, flaming by day, all that activity coming from passion and desire and so on, carrying on all the time. The wise man is the Buddha, the knife is wisdom, the instruction is to dig in the anthill and pull out these various objects, which of course are these various things that the monks are supposed to abandon, let go of. But as the Buddha says, at the bottom of the anthill, the Naga, just as in your dream, Kassapa, honour the Naga, do not harm the Naga. So I'd like to invoke the Naga here as representing, symbolising depth, psychic depth, that in us, that in our psyches, which is strong and beautiful. And yet, on the other hand, these Nagas are not really us. They're quite alien beings in a way. You can't get too close to Nagas. They're quite dangerous creatures. They're strong, they're very unhuman. They're quite amoral, actually, a lot of the time. And my suggestion is that the Nagas, which in this dream are honoured and respected, are that which can become free in our experience. In terms of Buddhist doctrine, you could say, who becomes free through practicing Buddhism? Well, it can't really be the ego, can it? Since in Buddhism we suppose that the ego is dependently arisen and is something of an illusion, ultimately speaking. So I think it's useful to think about, we're working to free the Nagas, that aspect of our being which is strong and beautiful and lives in the depths. And my interpretation, I think, is backed up by the fact that the Buddha is often described as a Mahanaga, a great Naga. And so too are Sariputta and Moggallana, the Buddha's chief disciples. They're described as Mahanagas. They're also described as having minds like wild deer. Minds like wild deer. Unconcerned, rather aloof, not involved. So there's another image of wildness, which perhaps connects with the Nagas. So I've invoked the Nagas as a theme, as a symbol for that which might become free through Buddhist practice. So I'll return now to just considering the situation more in the present moment. Here we are sitting here considering doors to freedom, the Buddha's teachings. What is it we experience that that makes us think that this is a desirable or interesting idea? The traditional Buddhist worldview involves is characterised with ordinary experience in terms of samsara. Samsara, the rolling on, literally speaking. Samsara is usually described as the round of rebirth produced by karma, by our actions, by our ethical actions. And this round is unending. It's an unending round of painful birth and death. And if one was to think in these terms, one can easily understand that this world picture gives us a motivation for turning to the Dharma, for asking what freedom is there in samsara, how do we become free? That's the traditional world picture of Buddhism. But I'm going to suggest that, contemporary Buddhists, we don't have to take on board that worldview if it isn't amenable to us. We can perfectly well think of our own experience. There are plenty of modern psychological kinds of accounts of that which might turn us to the Dharma, the Buddha's teaching. We might feel quite deeply we have a potential that is not yet realised. We have a potential for wisdom, for compassion, for peace, an active life of service, which we would like to realise. And it's painful while we don't feel able to do that. We might sense obstruction in our lives. We might sense lack of some mysterious way in which we're not able to act out our potential, live as we'd like. We might experience a lack of fulfilment. We might find our lives frustrating, both for external and internal reasons. In that sense, we have another motivation for turning to the Dharma. And of course, we might experience emotional pain. That's not going to be rare in our experience. Many of us might experience emotional pain and sense that the Dharma offers perhaps some way to find freedom. Freedom from being, as it were, pinned down by that emotional pain. So I'm suggesting we have reasons. We have reasons to turn to the Dharma, to wonder if the Dharma might offer a door to freedom. We could talk further about features of unawakened experience, of our experience which is not yet transformed by the Dharma, which we might describe as characterising unfree kind of experience. I'm just trying to characterise the opposite to the freedom which Buddhism leads to, this freedom of the Nagas that I characterise at the beginning. I don't think there's any way to pin this kind of thing down, but I came up with three kind of labels. I thought a feature of unawakened experience might be compulsion. Often we feel we suffer compulsion to act, think, speak in certain ways. As it were, we're not able, for some reason, to change certain patterns. I have a bad habit of watching sci-fi films late at night. The more exciting, the better. And when it starts to come up on me, I'd really like to watch this film. It's extremely hard to talk myself out of it. I've learned just to notice it and try and be kind and soften around it. I very rarely stop myself. I'm able to stop myself. And yet the morning after, I always think, oh, why did I do that? I'm tired. It was just not very good. So that's a confession. But compulsion, I'm sure I'm not the only one, and I'm sure it's not just sci-fi films. The internet's terrible like that, isn't it? Another feature of unawakened experience is distraction. I'm sure you're familiar with that. Often there's something we want to do, there's something that's very important to us, and what happens? We find ourselves doing other things. We're not quite able to do this thing that we really know is the important thing to do. We get distracted. Distraction is just a feature of our lives. And then there's indecision. Indecision, this can be quite painful, can't it, for some of us. Not being able to come to a sense of what it is I'm going to do. Without decision, without decisiveness, it's very hard to really find a sense of fulfilment in life. One needs to be decisive and act on commitment. This is how it is. But we're often indecisive. We suffer indecision. In my own experience, I had a period of about 5 years where I just got stuck in shall I get more involved in this Triratna Buddhist order, or shall I join the monastery, or what? And I talked it over with lots of people, and in the end I just came to the conclusion that I'm stuck in a kind of indecisiveness, and I just sat with it. I just had to sit with it, and I learned a lot from that, but it was definitely indecision, if you see what I mean. And finally, thanks to Lokabandhu, actually, we were on a pilgrimage in India, and we had a talk about this very thing, and he said, well, why don't you just ask for ordination and see what happens? He's very laid back, it's Lokabandhu. And my heart shifted. There was that heart shift to, yeah, I can do that. And it went from there. Soon enough, I was able to ask for ordination, and it unfolded. And being able to make a decision was just bliss. There you go. Now, the way I've been talking, the way I've been putting it, I hope it might start to be evident that the things that hold us back, those aspects of our experience which hold us back from realising our potential, I'm using that phrase, experiencing freedom, gaining the awakened state, perhaps, is a great way to put it. They're not conscious. If we really knew what was holding us back, would we do it? That's the question. Of course, there are things that we get confused about on the conscious level, things we know we're doing, and we need to, we can think about, we can reflect on. But a lot of the difficulties we experience, the pain, the dukkha in our life, is unconscious, I think. And that's what I want to move on to talk about now. This is the particular angle I want to take in relation to freedom. And I want to do that, firstly, by pointing out that sometimes people take up Buddhism, they turn to the Dharma with a very good aspiration of wishing to find freedom, to develop themselves, be of service to the world, and so on. But actually how they practice is characterised, as it were, by, it has the effect of trying to get round issues that are actually very difficult to face. Meditation can be a great way to find peace and stillness and not have to think about one's problems. That's great. But if that's one's entire way of approaching the Dharma, if we think of Buddhism and the Dharma as being able to get us to awakening and out of all this, out of this stuff that holds me back, eventually we run into problems. It doesn't really work. We kind of run into shallow water, I think. We get grounded. Our meditation starts to dry up. We start to maybe have certain kinds of symptoms. Compulsion, distraction, indecision, and so on. So sometimes our spiritual idealism can have a sort of shadow side, in that it's trying to bypass. Spiritual bypassing is the technical term invented by John Welwood, a Buddhist psychotherapist, which I think is a very important concept. Idealism and the attitude of heroically conquering samsara can have a certain sort of shadow side. So how on earth do we, as Buddhists, turn to these psychic depths in order to free the Nagas? Well, firstly, I suppose we need to come to some sense of what it is I'm talking about. We have ideas about what is unconscious, like there is some terrible, fiery, difficult, dark realm where all sorts of monsters dwell. Well, maybe that's the case, maybe it's not. It's perhaps best to simply think about aspects of our experience that, for whatever reason, are in the dark. They've become buried. Perhaps most importantly, have become unacknowledged. We no longer acknowledge them. And what is unacknowledged in our lives sort of disappears from view. And that's all we're talking about. We don't need to have a very complex and monstrous conception of the unconscious. If you remember Forbidden Planet, a sci-fi film from the 1950s, it culminates in the revelation of a really nasty monster who does a lot of killing, who turns out to be a monster of the id, which is to say the Freudian unconscious. It's a great film, but we don't need to think of the id as full of enormous killing monsters. It could be that those Nagas are are not just benign, but strong and beautiful. Unacknowledged means not included in our story of who we are. That's perhaps the simplest way to think about the kind of thing that, if we don't get in touch with, starts to create problems. And I think there's a very simple model, really, for what a kind of Buddhist psychotherapy might look like. I'm not a psychotherapist, I'm more of a Buddhist scholar and practitioner, but this is so simple, I can't think it's entirely wrong, that our task as Buddhists is to fundamentally to develop awareness, to become more present and mindful of our experience, to land in the present moment on that flight that we all took at the beginning of the festival. And by doing that, what we notice is that present experience is constantly changing. There's arising, there's passing away. Impermanence is a feature of our experience that's completely universal. It's constantly changing. What that means is that in our practice is that as we attend to impermanence and notice constant change, it becomes obvious that holding on to our experience causes problems. In a way, nothing's worth holding on to because it's all changing. We start to learn to flow, is one way to put it. Let go is another way to put it. And in doing so, we just come closer to the nature of things. That's a characterization of Buddhist practice in one of its essentials. What characterizes the unacknowledged, unconscious aspects of our experience is time doesn't operate there. This is the nature of the psyche, I think. In that darkness, what once happened in the past that we weren't able to deal with at that time gets lodged in the depths of our psyche, and there it doesn't change. It's lodged in a timeless kind of darkness. This is just a simple model. I'm sure everyone's experience is much more complicated in practice, but if you just go along with my thinking, you'll get the model. With an attention to what is unacknowledged, if we can turn to it, if we can be receptive to what is unacknowledged and unconscious in our experience, it, as it were, comes into the light of the present moment, it comes into time. That in itself is no kind of therapy or healing, but when something comes into time, it starts to change. This is the magic, as it were. When something comes into conscious experience, we don't have to do anything. Change happens. Emotions start to soften, move on. Conscious reflection can have all sorts of effects, and in that sense there's the possibility of that which was stuck and fixed becoming malleable and changing. And I'm sure it's the experience of mature Dharma practitioners that a lot of change has occurred in quite a lot of depth. It's slow, it's steady, requires a lot of attention, but it happens. So I have this is my model for a sort of depth psychology in Buddhism, a depth psychotherapy. I've talked as though meditation is the place where this occurs, and that's because my experience, I'm a meditative, reflective kind of practitioner. But for those of you, those Buddhists who are more active, more engaged, I'm sure all the same processes can occur in our working lives. That which occurs, that which happens to us, our reactions to things, tell us about our deeper patterns. And with a certain kind of reflection, an appropriate kind of reflection, perhaps also the active life can be a strong place of change of the depths. That's my thought. You might have some. We can share any experiences at the end, if you have something to add to this. So I have this model of how Buddhist psychotherapy works, and the doors to freedom, the 3 doors to freedom, which we've been exploring, or at least walking through on this retreat, or those of us who've been doing the ritual. They are aspects, 3 aspects of this process that I've been describing. Firstly, the first doorway has been called the limitless doorway to freedom, door to freedom. Limitless. The word in Pali or Sanskrit is animita, signless. It's the signless doorway. And what this means is that with the dropping of all labels in our experience, we experience no limits. That sounds perhaps a little bit obscure. These are very suggestive sort of Buddhist doctrines, I think. But we can easily start to appreciate what's meant on the more ordinary level. Those of you who've partaken in dance events here might have recognised that when one steps onto the dance floor, whether it's ecstatic dance or 5 rhythms or contact improvisation or whatever, all your labels about who you are become rather irrelevant. You put them down. You're just a moving body. And that moving body can do all sorts of things, can relate to people in entirely different ways, independent of, much less dependent on gender or sexuality or your role in life and all that kind of thing. And there's a very straightforward, really, or should I say, accessible version of a signless door to freedom, a kind of liberation. That's why we dance, isn't it? Partly, to experience that. But yet this isn't really liberation of the depths yet. This is a temporary bliss. I think often most of our senses of obstruction in life go back to early experience, to early childhood. Often, very early childhood, perhaps in the womb. This is where psychotherapy starts to work. Perhaps in very early experience, when we were so new and weak and powerless that we had no chance to deal with what goes on, what went on, what happened to us in the rough and tumble of life. I'm sure many of you have got your own kind of experience of this, and perhaps you might have a story about it. Whether you've got a story or whether you've just got a mute kind of experience of something that happened. Often, not often, I'd like to characterise those stories, those experiences as signs, as labels which exist in our experience, as it were in the depths of the psyche. Signs and labels in quite a neutral sense, but they're constantly informing you what your limits are. This is how it is. This is often how it feels. The reason we might experience compulsion or distraction or indecision is often connected to very old experiences which we've not been able to let go of and move on from. So I'd suggest that the practice of meditation, the practice of Buddhism, the allowing the experience of depth to arise into consciousness, turning towards the unacknowledged, can have the effect of allowing these ancient primal labels, signs, fixed senses of what's going on into awareness. Any of you who've done psychotherapy will recognise this process, I'm sure, but we can do it in ourselves, in our Buddhist experience, Buddhist practice, with the coming into consciousness of these ancient formations, which let's be honest, is very painful, very difficult. It's worth doing because we notice the labels as labels. We see arising and passing away. We see impermanence. We see that anything that's come into condition, come into existence, has certain conditions. When those conditions aren't there, they pass away. Now you're an adult, now you've got resources, we can do all sorts of things. We can do all sorts of things to move on in our experience. In that way, I think by abandoning labels and signs that exist in our experience, through attention to impermanence, we can access a signless door to freedom, a door into limitless experience. I'm making it grander than it feels. This is very simple, straightforward, just the pleasure of being more able to be alive in the present moment, through a purification, as it were, of our experience. So there's the first doorway. The second one is we've been talking about as the door to freedom, which is equanimity, or letting go. In Sanskrit, this is the apranihita vimoksha mukha, the unbiased or wishless door to freedom. Again, it's just a suggestive word, really. Equanimity and letting go gives us more of the flavour, I think. And again, I can characterise what's meant here in a very ordinary way. I'm used to drinking a cup of tea first thing in the morning. A good strong cup of tea. When I was coming to this festival on the way, I was a bit worried. How will I get my morning cup of tea? This is not the kind of place where morning cups of tea are going to be guaranteed, if you see what I mean. It's been great. Mostly I've had my morning cup of tea, but this morning the urn was not switched on, there was no hot water, no cup of tea. And yet, I think because this is a very mellow environment, I'm quite in touch with my experience. I've had some great dance experience. I just abandoned that wish and just drank a bit of water, and I was fine. This is very minor, isn't it? But for me, it was a kind of freedom. Yeah, I get these little worries about my morning tea, you know, in odd places. I carry electric kettles onto the continent to get my morning cup of tea. It's great. But this morning I experienced a bit of freedom through letting go. I experienced some equanimity, a bit of freedom. But on the deeper level, beyond the level of cups of tea, there's a lot of pain in our experience. We experience a lot of pain. Dukkha is not simply physical pain. It's the pain of not being able to trust that what we hope for in our experience will continue, that who we are and what we love will continue, because everything's changing all the time. That's painful. That's the pain of change. And it's also the pain of finding it difficult to know who we love, who we're connected with, because as we try and fix our sense of ourselves and who other people are in our lives, all this process tends to fall through our hands, again because everything's changing. We're really completely interdependent at the deepest level. So the only way to find relief from this pain is to let go into compassion, as it were, and stop looking for our own satisfaction, as it were, with a fixed sense of who we are. So there's this pain. Even the Buddha experienced pain, but only physical pain. he'd abandon the conditions that lead to emotional pain. So I think when we think about the depths here in terms of pain, we might find ourselves experiencing all sorts of deep grief, deep loss, sense of loss when we meditate as we move deeper into what goes on in our experience, sadness. And here's the real working ground of our experience. And we'll have to work out our own sense of what this means. But I'd like to suggest, for instance, that sadness and pain carries on through whole cultures. I heard on the radio, this is a completely ordinary kind of experience, a person from the generation who lived through the Second World War talking about how, you know, in those days we just put up with all the terrible things that happened because we had to. Yes, you know, many people died, many people lost loved ones. The world was a crazy, destructive place, but people got through. And she was saying, but people these days, they find such difficulty. They make such a fuss. But without, judging that person's experience, what they had to put up with is unenviable. Can human beings actually carry on just by putting aside things that are too difficult, terrors and difficulties that are too difficult to feel in the moment? My suggestion is, no, that's not possible. Eventually they catch up with us. Culturally, all the grief and pain of previous generations, actually, as soon as the conditions are ripe, in a way, I think, in terms of the psyche, and as soon as we enjoy the conditions in which it's possible for collected pain and difficulty, we're the ones who get to feel it. The more we meditate, especially, the more we move into some kind of psychic freedom, we get to feel what's collected up culturally, socially speaking. So there's real depths to our work with pain. And yet the same model applies. As we learn to live together, work through our differences, our fixed views and so on, arising and passing away occurs. We notice the rising and passing away. It's possible that we are able to start to become equanimous with what we feel, with the pain we experience, the grief and loss that has been collected up. And in this way we enter the door to freedom, which is equanimity, which is letting go. And this is depth, isn't it? This is a deep version of letting go. And it's not really personal, perhaps. Quite often the pain we feel isn't necessarily personal. And the third door to freedom is that of emptiness, the shunyata, the moksha mukha. It's been described on this festival as the door to freedom, which is mystery. Mystery. This is a lovely translation of shunyata. Usually translated emptiness also means openness. This relates to the characteristic of experience, which is that there's no fixed self, ultimately. Our idea of a fixed sense of who we are, ultimately speaking, is just an idea. When we look into things, the arising and passing away, there's just change. Who we think we are is a thought. What's really there is emptiness, openness, mystery. I think you've probably all, in your experience of this festival, stepped into some workshop, some conversation, some event in which you've experienced a bit more openness than you might normally experience. This is a place of great magic like that. All sorts of moments occur in which you find yourself experiencing things quite anew. I guess that's part of why we're here. much more deeply, working with depths again. I'd suggest that who we think we are, our fixed sense of who we are, goes right back through time again to our ancestors. I'll give you a quick example. My grandfather was a stained glass window artist. He loved his work as an artist, and yet at a certain point he gave it up. He had to give it up through financial constraints. He came to work as a grocer, to do something much more down to earth, much more straightforward. And involved in that was a strong sense of duty, his duty to his family, his duty to those he loved. And that sense of duty, that sense of having to put aside what you love in order to do what is right, is like an attitude or view which informed his sense of who he was. And for some reason, and I don't know the mechanism, these values, these deep values, they continue, they get passed on. And in my experience, I've found myself aware of the need to do my duty, and yet on the other hand, very much wanting to do what I want, and completely stuck, as it were. I've run away from getting a job for a long time. But recently, I've entered into a career teaching at a university, and I find it very satisfying. And that ancestral sense of the need to do one's duty has caught up with me. I get a lot of anxiety when I'm teaching. And I think, in my interpretation, I was deeply reflecting on this on retreat recently, is that these values, this fixed sense of who I am, goes back to my ancestors, and my job is to sit with awareness and to, as it were, purify that fixed sense of what life is, of what a person is, what it is to be a human being, on behalf of those who've gone before. So again, practicing the Dharma can lead to freedom, not just in the surface present day sense, but in a very deep sense. We enter a freedom which comes from appreciating impermanence, living with pain, appreciating that our experience is not fixed. Who we are is not a fixed thing. This is hard work. This is a difficult process, but it's one that we're all called to do as Buddhists, and this is tremendously satisfying. I'll conclude again with the Nagas. I started by invoking the Nagas as the symbol of psychic depth, the strength and beauty that is released, as it were, through, or respected and honoured through Dharma practice. This is also from the Pali Canon. I started off with the Pali Canon. It's my love, as it were, studying the Pali Canon. The Buddha once said, "In the Himalayas, the kings among mountains, the Nagas, work out their bodies and build up their strength." You can imagine the Nagas building up their strength, working out their bodies. Having worked out and built themselves up, they plunge into ponds. Having plunged into ponds, they plunge into lakes. Can you imagine the huge strength of these Nagas just plunging through the waters of the mountains? Having plunged into lakes, they plunge into streams, big streams. Having plunged into streams, they plunge into rivers. Having plunged into rivers, they plunge into the great ocean, the sea. There, they come into the full vastness of their bodily forms. So the form they had up in the mountains, that which they worked at and built up, was just a forerunner of their full vastness, which requires the space of the sea. Likewise, the virtuous Buddhist practitioner, established in ethics or virtue, cultivating and multiplying the factors of awakening, mindfulness, energy, investigation of dharmas, rapture. Forgotten the sixth one. I think it's concentration and equanimity. Cultivating and multiplying the factors of awakening fulfills the full vastness of good things. So here we have the Buddhist practitioner attaining to freedom, not in a personal sense, but like the freedom of the Nagas, to move through conditions, to plunge into the sea, and to come into the full vastness of their bodily form. And likewise, the Buddhist practitioner comes into the full vastness of good things through Buddhist practice. Thank you very much.